Have you ever seen a farmer fend off a ruthless biker gang using nothing but his wits, sheer bravery, and, believe it or not, an expert's hand with a harpoon? That's exactly the kind of excitement you'll find in our story today. From tense showdowns on storm-battered docks to daring stunts involving specialized rescue gear hidden away in a dusty old barn, every moment will have you on the edge of your seat. Will our quiet hero manage to outsmart hardened ex-military criminals? Or will they push him and the entire town past the breaking point? Stick around to the very end of this thrilling tale to uncover the surprising twist that ties everything together. And while you're here, be sure to subscribe to the Farmer Story channel to show your support and discover more captivating stories. They believed that defacing a retired farmer's old tractor in Harbor Point, Maine, would send a clear message to everyone in the community. The Onyx Tide Motorcycle Gang had spread fear up and down the coastal region for the past half year, sabotaging fishing boats, trashing farmland, and pressuring small businesses into paying steep dock fees and protection money. Their reputation for violence and extortion escalated quickly, and locals began to whisper that the Onyx Tide was merely the outward face of a far more insidious criminal network. This gang, so people whispered, trafficked in stolen goods, ran complicated smuggling routes, and possibly dabbled in unregulated weapons dealing. But to the Onyx Tide, one person in particular, the unassuming Leroy Samson, looked like an easy target. Their limited research told them he was simply an aging farmer whose prime had passed decades ago. What they didn't realize was that Leroy had spent 3 decades as the Atlantic coast's top marine rescue operator, a man whose skill with harpoons and high seas had become the stuff of maritime legend. From the outside, Leroy's farm appeared ordinary enough: a modest house overlooking green fields and a small barn storing his weathered John Deere tractor. Yet inside that barn, carefully hidden behind bales of hay and shelves of rusted tools, sat heavy-duty waterproof cases containing gear rarely seen outside specialized Coast Guard units. Leroy's experience was not casual either. He had once led rescue missions that even the most hardened Coast Guard captains deemed too risky. For years, he had been the go-to operator for so-called impossible saves during wild storms, the kind that battered the Maine shoreline with ruthless force. His eye for detail, lightning-fast reflexes, and unshakable calm under pressure had saved countless lives. He hadn't chosen retirement in Harbor Point by accident. The quiet farmland had seemed the perfect place to bury the anguish of rescues that had gone horribly wrong when the ocean claimed lives despite all of his efforts. But early one misty morning, Leroy discovered the shocking state of his tractor. It was beyond normal vandalism. Hoses and wiring had been cut methodically, tires slashed in a distinct pattern, and the engine's most expensive components seemed purposely ruined. Long gouges scraped across the green paint, revealing the metal beneath. An experienced rescuer like Leroy understood sabotage when he saw it, and each cut told him a story of premeditation. Standing near the destroyed tractor, he recalled the faint rumble of motorcycles the night before. Though he had been sleeping, he remembered opening his eyes to the distant roar of engines. Perhaps if he had been fully awake, he might have fended them off, but Leroy never expected someone would pick his modest farm as a target. Soon enough, he realized this was part of a bigger pattern. Farmers, fishermen, and small-scale tradespeople in Harbor Point had all faced a new wave of intimidation in recent weeks. The Onyx Tide's modus operandi was alarmingly consistent: damage equipment, threaten livelihoods, and then swoop in with an offer of protection. Most local folks, lacking the means to fight back, went along with these deals. Leroy, however, was not most people. With rough, calloused fingers tracing the deep cuts in his tractor, Leroy felt an old stir in his gut, a warning that always rose inside him when a dangerous storm brewed at sea. This time, however, the storm was of a very different kind, one involving criminals who vastly underestimated the skill set of the man they had just provoked. "Bad business about your tractor, Leroy," said Bill Donnelly, Leroy's longtime friend and neighbor, as he leaned against the frame of the barn. The farmyard smelled of damp hay and fertilizer, and a thick haze of morning fog rolled in off the Atlantic, covering the distant farmland in white. Bill's years tending his own patch of land had given him a rugged appearance, his skin sun-worn and his eyes perpetually narrowed by a lifetime of working in the glare of the sun. He'd seen 4 separate acts of vandalism in the past month, one on his own irrigation system, and he knew precisely who was to blame. They picked the wrong farm this time, he muttered, gaze flicking between the shredded tires on Leroy's tractor and the stoic expression on Leroy's weathered face. A crunch of gravel snapped them both to attention. A Harbor Patrol SUV rolled up, headlights dim against the fog. Out stepped Audrey Samson, Leroy's daughter, the youngest lieutenant in the local Harbor Patrol. She had spent her entire career grappling with bureaucratic limitations while striving to maintain integrity. Harbor Point was small, but it had its own unique brand of trouble, especially these days. Audrey carried herself with an air of unwavering purpose, the sort developed through years of navigating fraught situations. She took one look at the mangled tractor, her jaw tightening. "It's worse than I heard," she said softly, then opened a notepad. "Any fresh tire tracks, footprints, signs of forced entry?" Leroy shook his head. "Nothing obvious. They knew exactly where to cut, though. This wasn't just random hooliganism. They took out the systems that matter most." As Audrey began taking photos with her phone, Bill offered details about the wave of extortion that had swept through Harbor Point. "You know about the Onyx Tide," he said grimly. "They're not just a band of rowdy bikers. They got their claws into local officials, too. Chief Donovan from the police force has been conveniently looking the other way. Whenever someone complains, he says there's not enough evidence or we're investigating." Audrey scowled. "So we're stuck again. We can't arrest them if no one will testify, and any legal route is blocked by higher-ups who refuse to see the bigger picture." She gave her father a careful look. "You're not planning to do anything crazy, are you?" she asked. Leroy offered a wry smile. "Me? I'm just a farmer tending my land," he replied. In truth, a methodical part of his mind, the part sharpened by 3 decades of rescue work, had begun analyzing the gang's tactics. Just as he used to assess wave patterns and current shifts during storms, he now assessed intimidation cycles and routes used by the Onyx Tide. "I'll be at the meeting tonight at Ming's restaurant," he finally said. "It's time the town takes this seriously." Not long after Audrey drove off, the muffled roar of motorcycle engines approached. Bill's shoulders tensed as he recognized the Onyx Tide patches. 3 bikers slowed by the farm's front fence, scanning the barn and the fields, making sure Leroy saw them. Their leader, a burly man with a scattering of gray in his beard and an ex-military bearing, lifted a hand in a mocking salute. Then, with a sudden rev, the group disappeared back into the rolling fog. Their message was clear: "We're watching you." After Bill left, Leroy made for his barn, stepping past hay bales toward the locked cabinets in the back. He unlatched one of them, revealing rows of specialized rescue gear: marine radars, compressed air launchers, metal shafts that attach to harpoon tips, and advanced radio sets capable of operating in vicious storms. Despite retiring from official service, Leroy had kept everything carefully maintained. Shutting the cabinet, he exhaled slowly. The Onyx Tide might see him as an old farmer, but he still possessed the calm, methodical approach that had once made him indispensable in the most dangerous corners of the Atlantic. That evening, the warm glow of Ming's restaurant lights offered a small reprieve from the encroaching darkness outside. Rows of fishing nets and framed photos of past generations adorned the walls, providing a sense of history that reminded everyone of Harbor Point's proud maritime traditions. The usual mouth-watering scent of fresh lobster chowder and homemade bread wafted through the air, but something heavier than steam lingered: a collective unease among the patrons. Almost every seat was taken by fishermen, farmers, and local shopkeepers who had arrived with anxious faces. Wei Ming, the restaurant's proprietor, stood near the register, his brow knit with concern. "My boat was sabotaged last week," he told those nearest to him. "Holes drilled beneath the waterline. Didn't sink it outright, but enough to cost me thousands in repairs." He shook his head and gazed around with something akin to despair. "It's not random. The Onyx Tide picks off those who refuse to pay their fees." Harriet Ming, Wei's wife and the force keeping the restaurant afloat, moved between the tables with a coffee pot, occasionally stopping to reassure a worried neighbor. She refilled Leroy's mug and whispered, Audrey's worried about you, Leroy. Says you have the same look as you did during that historic gale rescue of '99. Remember that? When half the Coast Guard wouldn't go out. But you did? Leroy only grunted in response, turning his attention to the front of the restaurant where Bill Donnelly was trying to rally the crowd. Bill cleared his throat and spoke loudly enough to quiet the room. We've had 4 separate acts of vandalism in as many weeks. Boats, tractors, irrigation systems. Nothing safe, and each time the Onyx Tide shows up a day later with some insurance plan. Either you fork over their so-called fees, or your livelihood ends up ruined. Now, I don't want to stand here and point fingers, but someone's letting them get away with it. We all know who I mean. He didn't mention Chief Donovan's name directly, but everyone understood. An uneasy silence followed until Harriet placed her hands on her hips, scanning the crowd. Well, are we just going to sit here and complain, or do something about it? Her eyes fell on Leroy, a man with gray at his temples but still carrying the posture of someone who'd spent years standing on pitching decks during wild seas. Leroy slowly rose to his feet. We can talk all night about the problem, he said calmly, or we can organize. Harbor Point has always taken care of its own, whether that's pulling in fish or banding together in storms. This situation isn't any different, except the storm is man-made. Nods of agreement sprang up around the room, but the momentum was suddenly crushed by the resounding chime of the front door. In strode 3 members of the Onyx Tide, clad in worn leather jackets bearing their distinctive emblem, a skull superimposed on crashing waves. At their heads stood Cross-Current Roberts, a tall, wiry man with eyes that never seemed to blink. He took one long look around, lips curling in a sneer. We heard there was a little community gathering, he said, each word dripping sarcasm. Harriet positioned herself between him and the rest of the patrons, voice steady as she said, We're closed for a private event. The sign is on the door. In an instant, the tension escalated, and the soft clinking of silverware halted as everyone seemed to hold their breath. Cross-Current smiled a predatory smile and tipped his chin toward Leroy. Didn't know you folks were so organized. Well, we just dropped by to let you know the roads have been extra rough lately. Accidents happen. His gaze landed on Bill, then Leroy. You might want to watch yourselves. Audrey, who had entered unnoticed just moments earlier, stepped forward. The shiny badge on her uniform glinted in the overhead lighting. Is that some sort of threat, Roberts? She asked, her voice firm. Cross-Current's face twitched into feigned innocence. Me? I'm just reminding these good people that the roads can be dangerous. The storms, the potholes, anything can happen. Yet his mocking tone revealed the underlying menace. Leroy studied the 3 bikers closely, the way he had learned to assess potential hazards at sea. The 2 men flanking Cross-Current stood with feet slightly apart, as if anticipating a confrontation. Their leather cuts bore the same Onyx Tide logo, and each wore an expression that dared anyone to challenge them. Cross-Current himself, arms covered in faded tattoos, gave off a sense of forced calm that only partially masked the violence coiled beneath. Bill looked ready to say something, but Leroy quietly placed a hand on his shoulder, shaking his head. The older man recognized the potential for a sudden and brutal altercation. He'd seen how easily a small spark could escalate into an inferno, on land as well as on the ocean. Instead, Leroy spoke in an even tone. The roads might be rough, but the sea's even rougher. And in this town, we know our storms. Cross-Current's mask of confidence faltered for just a moment, surprised by the old man's cryptic reply. You talking nonsense, Grandpa? Harriet jumped in. I think what Leroy's trying to say is that people around here look out for each other. You boys might find that out soon enough if you push too far. The faintest flicker of uncertainty crossed the faces of the Onyx Tide bikers, but Cross-Current quickly recovered, let out a short laugh and clapped his hands once, a gesture that echoed loudly across the tense restaurant. Well, we wouldn't want to spoil this lovely gathering any further, he said, gesturing to his 2 companions. Seems like y'all have important things to discuss, like how to keep your property from getting wrecked. The 3 bikers turned to leave, but Cross-Current paused just at the door, pivoting to fix Audrey with an unsettling stare. By the way, Lieutenant, he said, Chief Donovan mentioned you might be looking at a new post, some desk job in a warmer office. Congratulations, if that pans out. With that, they were gone, the echo of revving motorcycle engines soon swallowed by the night. The restaurant's patrons let out a collective breath. "We're outmatched," muttered one fisherman. "They have Chief Donovan in their pocket, right?" Harriet snapped. "We don't know how deep that connection goes, but it sure feels like it's real. Every time we file a complaint, Donovan says his hands are tied." More angry murmurs washed over the gathering. Wei Ming, stepping out from the back kitchen, lamented about the boat repairs and the empty bank account he was left with. Another farmer spoke up about his damaged irrigation system. The refrain was the same: intimidation, sabotage, and then the forced acceptance of the Onyx Tide's so-called protection. Once calm returned, Audrey hammered home the point. "We need evidence that sticks, but we also have to protect ourselves." "Dad," she looked at Leroy with a mix of concern and determination, "I hope your plan involves more than just direct confrontation. These guys are ex-military, rumored to have special ops experience, and the last thing I want is a bloodbath on Harbor Point streets." Leroy nodded. "No bloodbath," he said simply. But in the recesses of his mind, he pictured the special equipment locked away in his barn, the harpoons and gear that had once allowed him to pull survivors from the clutches of violent storms. He had no intention of letting these criminals destroy his home. The following morning brought an even thicker fog that blanketed the entire area, including the docks where the lifeblood of Harbor Point, its fishing fleet, was moored. As Leroy hopped into his pickup truck, the radio buzzed with news of yet another vandalism, this time on the far side of town. A lobster boat named Sea Strider had found its engine sabotaged and hull scratched with the Onyx Tide's threatening symbol. "They're picking up the pace," Leroy thought, stepping on the gas. He headed toward the waterfront to meet with his friend, Gus Bear Rogers, a gruff but loyal ally who had spent years as a maritime rescue swimmer under Leroy's command. Bear ran a small marine electronics shop, though it mostly served as a front for his specialized knowledge in advanced rescue and tactical gear. He wore a perpetual scowl that masked an empathetic heart. "Got your message," Bear said by way of greeting, arms folded across his broad chest. "Heard about your tractor, too. Figured you might be coming around." Leroy nodded. "They're forcing my hand, Bear. I've tried to ignore them, hoping the law would catch up, but that's not happening. Now they're terrorizing our neighbors, blowing through farmland, damaging fishing rigs, Harbor Point's on the brink." He lowered his voice as a couple of unsuspecting patrons entered the shop in search of a standard depth finder. "What do we have in stock?" he asked quietly. Bear grunted and jerked his head toward the back room, where the walls were lined with stealthy radio devices, specialized underwater cameras, and salvage drones that could be repurposed for surveillance. Over the next half hour, they mapped out a plan. Using the storm patterns predicted to roll in over the next few nights, Leroy intended to set up concealed vantage points near the old cannery and the breakwater. Bear would patch them into shortwave communications gear, enabling real-time updates. "They rely on intimidation and speed," Leroy said, checking the specs of a small submersible camera. "But they're also counting on folks not working together. Harbor Point is bigger than they think." Around that time, Audrey contacted Leroy by phone, her tone urgent. "Dad, I have partial intel. The Onyx Tide is meeting some associates from out of town. Might be a major transaction. Chief Donovan's called off our patrol boats for maintenance. Coincidental timing, right? This means they'll have the waterways clear." Leroy answered swiftly. "Send me the details. Bear and I are setting up a watch of our own." Before hanging up, Audrey added, "Just be careful." Leroy then drove to Bill Donnelly's farm, where a loose coalition of farmers, fishermen, and longtime residents had started to gather. Word had spread that Leroy Samson was quietly mobilizing an independent watch group. When Leroy stepped out of his truck, Bill beckoned him over. "We're with you," Bill said. "We've had enough. We can't stand by while they ruin everything." At the same time, Harriet and Wei Ming arrived with their nephew Zach Ming, who had lost weeks of fishing due to sabotage. They volunteered knowledge of a hidden inlet that most of the official maps had wrong. "We can use that as an approach route," Harriet explained, placing a local chart on Bill's dusty workbench. "They won't see us coming." As dusk crept in that same day, Leroy found himself standing at the edge of a rocky outcropping overlooking the churning Atlantic. Despite the calm veneer of the sea at that moment, he sensed an oncoming storm. This was second nature to him. Some folks called it a sixth sense, born from years of reading wind patterns, wave crests, and barometric shifts. The sky off to the east was heavy with low-hanging clouds, and Leroy knew from experience that a squall would soon be upon them. Perfect cover for covert operations, he mused. Returning to his barn, he carefully pulled open the doors. It smelled of old straw and motor oil, the familiar aroma of his daily routines. But behind one makeshift wall was a hidden compartment where he stored his most treasured and formidable equipment. He ran a hand over a set of special harpoon shafts designed to anchor rescue lines even in turbulent waters. Alongside them lay high-tensile cables and grappling hooks, the latter originally used in vertical cliff rescues. In Leroy's mind, these objects told stories of frantic sea rescues during monster storms. Now they would serve a different purpose. He loaded a handful of this gear into the back of his pickup, ensuring it was concealed under tarps. The next stop, Bear's Marine Electronics Shop. By the time he arrived, darkness was nearly complete. A single light illuminated the shop's interior, where Bear was waiting with a row of sealed crates. Got the shortwave sets prepped, Bear muttered, popping open a crate to reveal rugged handheld radios. And I fitted these old drones with night vision cameras. Not the best range, but they'll do in a pinch. They spent the next few hours fine-tuning the plan. Bear would station himself at an abandoned watchtower near the breakwater, using a mounted thermal camera to track any suspicious vessels. Bill Donnelly and a group of farmers volunteered to run interference on land, using their tractors and trucks to quickly block roads if the Onyx Tide attempted a hurried exit. Harriet Way and Zach Ming would monitor the hidden inlet, ready to relay warnings through the shortwave radios. Leroy and Audrey would maintain a roving position. Audrey on official harbor patrol business, even if Chief Donovan remained unhelpful, and Leroy using his personal boat, discreetly outfitted with advanced navigation gear. But time was of the essence. Intelligence had trickled in that some major deal was going down soon, possibly involving stolen goods or even weapons. The Onyx Tide's sudden aggression, ratcheting up threats and vandalism, suggested they were trying to secure their territory before a big payoff. As they coordinated, Leroy couldn't help recalling his days leading rescue missions under pitch-black skies, forging ahead despite waves threatening to capsize even large Coast Guard cutters. The current predicament felt strangely similar. A mission with high stakes, the need for absolute precision, and an unforgiving environment. Eventually, Bear paused, leaning against a bench strewn with cables. "You sure about all this, Leroy? We're not exactly the Coast Guard here. And these guys, some are ex-military with real training. One slip and people could get killed." Leroy met his friend's uneasy gaze. "That's why we're doing this carefully. We're not going looking for a fight. We're preventing one. If we lock down the routes, gather enough evidence, and coordinate with federal authorities who aren't in Donovan's pocket, we can cut this off at the root." Bear exhaled. "All right then," he said. "Let's get it done." The next evening arrived with the predicted storm, wind and rain lashing Harbor Point's docks. Low thunder rumbled across the sky, and lightning danced along the horizon, briefly illuminating fishing vessels secured in their slips. Audrey was finishing up her shift at Harbor Patrol, ignoring repeated suggestions from Chief Donovan that she remain at the station. "Just doing a final sweep of the harbor," she claimed, refusing to be sidelined. Meanwhile, Leroy guided his modest but seaworthy boat, an aging center console craft, to a vantage point near the breakwater, where the large waves made for rough going. Even from afar, Leroy could see the Onyx Tide had stepped up their operations. Two high-powered speedboats sporting the gang's emblem were stationed near a set of old piers, engines idling. Their riders, clad in rain slickers, appeared to be waiting for someone. Over the shortwave radio, Harriet's voice crackled. "Leroy, this is Harriet at the inlet. No unusual activity on our side, but the tides are shifting quickly. If anyone tries to scoot through these hidden channels, we'll see them." Leroy responded calmly. "Copy that, Harriet. Keep your eyes open." Then Bear's voice came through. "I've got movement at the cannery's old slipway. Looks like they're moving crates by forklift from a truck into a fishing trawler that doesn't belong to any local. I'll try to get a better vantage." Leroy gripped the wheel, bracing as a wave rocked his boat. The rain pelted down like gravel, and the squall's gusts tugged at everything not secured. Yet for Leroy, these were familiar conditions, reminiscent of the countless storms he had weathered on rescue missions. His boat rocked violently, but he advanced further, eyes scanning for any sign of the bigger fish rumored to be meeting the Onyx Tide. Suddenly, Bear's urgent voice cut in again. "Hold on, I've got something else. There's a yacht coming in from open water. Doesn't have its AIS transponder on. Looks high-end. Could be the buyer or their associates." Leroy's jaw tightened. If the Onyx Tide was dealing with external criminals, the stakes might be higher than even he had guessed. On land, Bill Donnelly and his group of farmers kept watch over the roads leading away from the cannery. Their tractors were hidden just out of sight, ready to block any abrupt getaway attempts. Meanwhile, Harriet and Wei Ming coordinated a small flotilla of fishing boats near the hidden inlet to ensure no one snuck out by water. The entire operation hummed with tension, each participant acutely aware that they were civilians up against an organized, well-armed gang. But every single one of them also knew that stepping back would mean surrendering their home to the Onyx Tide's ruthless control. The wind howled, rattling Leroy's boat. Flashes of lightning revealed cross-current Roberts and another tough-looking biker at the edge of the cannery pier, shouting instructions at a forklift driver. They seemed in a hurry, transferring sealed crates from a truck onto the deck of a battered old fishing vessel. Leroy's radio hissed with static as Audrey, from her harbor patrol skiff, murmured, "I'm in position near the southwestern buoy. Chief Donovan just radioed, ordering me back to base, but I'm ignoring him for now. Dad, be careful." Leroy steadied the boat, heart pounding. He knew that once the Onyx Tide realized Harbor Point wasn't bending, a violent showdown could erupt at any moment. Lightning struck one of the old harbor pylons, lighting up the skies in a ghostly flash. In that instant, Leroy caught sight of Breaker Anderson, rumored to be the second in command of the Onyx Tide. Breaker's imposing silhouette was outlined by the glow, revealing a man with the stance of someone trained in the military. Word around town was that he had been dishonorably discharged from the Navy years back. His reputation for brutality preceded him, and Leroy could sense the tension in every line of the man's posture. "You seeing this, Leroy?" Bear's voice cut through the heavy static on the shortwave. "Breaker is definitely on scene, barking orders. They're loading up those crates fast. Could be firearms, drugs, or something bigger." Bear paused, then added, "We've got to get some kind of proof." And Leroy surveyed the pounding waves and howling wind. Conditions were deteriorating. For a moment, he felt a familiar adrenaline surge, reminiscent of rescue operations where a single miscalculation could cost lives. "Bear," he radioed, "angle the drone if you can. Get the camera on those crates. We need a record." From the vantage point of the old watchtower, Bear maneuvered a repurposed salvage drone, its camera feeding a grainy but serviceable video to a small monitor. The drone wobbled in the high wind, but Bear managed to snag a few precious seconds of footage, men hauling suspiciously heavy containers labeled with false shipping codes. In the background, Breaker's gloved hand could be seen gesturing toward the forklift driver to hurry. The image froze as the drone's signal cut out. "Battery or weather? Not sure," Bear cursed, "but I've got enough footage to show probable illicit cargo." On the water, Leroy circled farther from the breakwater, positioning himself behind an old shrimping boat to remain unseen. Every flash of lightning revealed more activity around the cannery pier. Meanwhile, Harriet's voice piped in from the inlet team. "We're seeing no movement here, Leroy. Could be they're concentrating everything at the cannery." Audrey's status report followed. "Harbor Patrol is in partial lockdown because of the storm. Chief Donovan claims all vessels must return for safety reasons. Sounds like he's giving the Onyx Tide free rein." She paused. "But I'm staying out here with you." Suddenly, Leroy caught a different set of lights approaching through the turbulent waves, the high-end yacht Bear had mentioned. "Bear," he radioed, "that fancy boat is making its way in. Keep your eyes open. This might be the moment." Sure enough, the yacht eased beside the battered fishing trawler, and a tense exchange began. Leroy squinted through binoculars, watching silhouettes on deck engage in what looked like a hurried negotiation. In the midst of the intensifying storm, Leroy realized the timing was no accident. The Onyx Tide chose these conditions for a reason. Fewer witnesses, no official patrols, and a perfect excuse for any accidents, that might befall nosy locals. But they had not accounted for the unity simmering in Harbor Point. Through the shortwave, Bill's voice crackled. "We're set on the roads, Leroy. Just give the word." Harriet chimed in, "Same here." Leroy tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He had not expected to return to high-stakes maneuvers, but here he was, on the front line, about to call the final shot. As the exchange continued between the fishing trawler and the luxury yacht, Leroy carefully edged his boat closer, cutting the engine to drift silently with the wind and current. Visibility was rough, but every burst of lightning momentarily transformed the harbor into a stark panorama of clandestine activity. He glimpsed Breaker Anderson and Cross-Current Roberts on the trawler's deck alongside two men in tailored coats who seemed completely out of place on a stormy Maine night. Their stiff postures and polished shoes suggested they were big-time financiers or high-end criminals who did not typically get their hands dirty. From the corner of his eye, Leroy spotted movement, a smaller skiff emerging from the far side of the cannery. Another three bikers wearing Onyx Tide patches were steering it, possibly acting as security. Leroy keyed his radio. "Audrey, small skiff approaching from the cannery. Don't let them cut us off." On the other end, Audrey's voice replied without hesitation, "On it." Despite her fatherly concern, Leroy knew Audrey was more than capable. She had inherited his steady focus under pressure, refined by her own police training. In the swirling darkness, Leroy heard the engine of Audrey's Harbor Patrol skiff rev, heading toward the interlopers. Over the radio came the shout of a man startled by the sudden presence of law enforcement. Leroy allowed himself a tight smile. Distraction achieved. But the next lightning flash revealed Breaker's face turned toward the commotion, and his eyes narrowed. The calm facade slipped from Breaker's features, replaced by something colder. With a curt command, he pointed to a couple of his men who scrambled to break down what appeared to be a sniper rifle. Bear's exasperated voice echoed next. "They've got heavy arms. Leroy, do not let that rifle get set up. You're in its crosshairs if they spot you." Leroy felt his pulse thud in his temples. This was escalating faster than planned. If the Onyx Tide started firing in the middle of the harbor, there was every chance innocent lives would be lost. He steered his boat into a deeper section of water, looping around the cannery's perimeter. With the wind in his favor, he hoped the roar of the storm would mask his approach. Meanwhile, Bill Donnelly radioed in from land. "Leroy, we just heard gunshots. Are you okay out there?" Leroy clenched his jaw. "Gunshots already? We haven't fired a thing. Could be warning shots." At that moment, Harriet came online. "Some of our folks at the inlet reported distant gunfire too, but it might be echoes. They've got to be scaring off potential witnesses." Lightning flared once more, and Leroy froze. He saw Breaker leveling the rifle straight out into the darkness of the harbor. Then a shot rang out, slicing the night. Leroy's boat jerked violently, whether from the wave or a near-miss bullet, he wasn't sure. "That's enough," Leroy growled, and grabbed one of the specialized harpoon launchers from a concealed compartment. Bracing himself, he aimed toward the deck of the trawler, hoping to hit the structural support near the rail. If he could snag the line, he might disrupt their vantage long enough for Audrey to close in and ensure no one started firing indiscriminately. Clang! The harpoon tip anchored itself into the trawler's metal railing, making a jarring screech that was audible even over the storm. Leroy quickly secured the line to a mount on his boat, effectively tethering the two vessels together in a precarious dance. Shocked shouts erupted from the Onyx Tide's men, who scrambled to see what had just happened. The rifle-wielding thug stumbled as the boat lurched to one side, losing his aim. Leroy seized the advantage, wrenching on the line with a mechanical hoist so the trawler was forced to angle itself, partially limiting the shooter's field of fire. Cross-Current Roberts barked orders, and the man tried to swing the rifle around again, but another large wave struck the hull, sending him careening into the cabin wall. Somewhere behind Leroy, a far-off scream or shout blended with the thunder. He couldn't focus on that now. His single priority was preventing any bullets from flying toward Audrey or the neighboring fishing vessels. Bear's voice burst into the radio with unguarded triumph. "Leroy, I'm capturing all of this on the drone's feed. They're brandishing weapons, firing at law enforcement. That's the evidence we need to bring in bigger agencies." Leroy grimaced, thinking about how dangerous it was to rely on a battered salvage drone in this weather. Just keep that feed going, he replied. We end this soon. The forging bond between Leroy's boat and the trawler forced cross-current and Breaker's men to adjust. At the same time, Harriet and Wei Ming led a pair of fishing boats around the far side, cutting off an escape route. Over on the southwestern side, Audrey engaged the smaller skiff, lights flashing as she used a loudspeaker to command them to stand down. With the line secured, Leroy peered through the gloom, searching for any sign of the luxury yacht. He finally caught sight of it drifting away, engines sputtering to life. The suited men had clearly decided this was too risky. Leroy frowned. If they got away, the real players behind this operation might vanish into the night. Harriet, the yacht is trying to slip out, he radioed. Any chance you can intercept? Roger that, Harriet answered. We'll try, but they're faster. Might need backup from Bill and the land crew if they attempt to dock somewhere else. Back on the trawler, Breaker had recovered from his initial shock. Leroy spotted him shouting directions. A biker attempted to cut the harpoon line with bolt cutters. Leroy revved his engine, easing away to tighten the line further. The strain on the metal rail was now enormous. It groaned ominously, pulling the trawler's bow off course. Leroy hoped it was enough to stop them from retrieving that rifle, at least for a few moments more. Suddenly, a burst of muzzle flash from the deck told him the fight had escalated yet again. The bullet smacked into Leroy's boat near the stern, sending shards of fiberglass into the air. He ducked behind the console, heart hammering. If they went purely lethal, the entire plan would crumble into chaos. Without hesitation, Leroy swung the boat's spotlight around to blind the gunman on the trawler. The glaring beam caught him mid-aim, and the man flinched, reflexively shielding his eyes. Leroy seized the moment, snapping a second specialized harpoon into position. Even though he was older and no longer in active service, Leroy's hands remembered what to do in crisis. Years of practice let him manage the rocking deck, controlling his breath so he could fire with remarkable precision. The harpoon hissed through the storm-lashed air and slammed into the side of the trawler's cabin. The attached line might not fully disable them, but it would definitely restrict the shooter's movements. He felt the recoil in his shoulder and took a beat to confirm contact. Then a triumphant whoop burst through the radio. Bear again. Perfect hit. I can see it from my vantage. They won't be able to pivot that cabin door now. Leroy's short chuckle came out as more of a grunt, relief mixed with the knowledge that the confrontation was still far from over. On the cannery pier, the forklift operators had ceased their loading, uncertain whether to continue under gunfire. Several men milled about, evidently deciding whether to cut and run. Cross-current Roberts roared at them, brandishing a sidearm. A few cowered. Others seemed torn between fear of the Onyx Tide and fear of the gathering noose of enraged townsfolk. Meanwhile, a wave soared against the side of the trawler, nearly knocking Breaker down. Leroy couldn't help but draw parallels to his days at sea. In every rescue mission, there was a tipping point when either you pulled everyone back to safety or watched them slip below the surface. This was that moment for Harbor Point. By then, Harriet Way and Zach Ming had corralled the yacht's path, but the crew aboard the luxury vessel refused to comply with instructions. They revved their engines, slicing through the chop with near-reckless speed, aiming for open water. However, Harriet knew these channels like the back of her hand. She guided her boat deftly, forcing them to swerve dangerously close to an outcropping of rocks. Over the shared radio, Harriet called, "They might beach themselves if they're not careful, Leroy." Simultaneously, Bill Donnelly's land team blocked the exit roads with tractors and trucks, headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. "They're pinned, Leroy," Bill's voice crackled. "Any vehicles that try to bolt from the cannery are in for a rude surprise." Amid the swirling chaos, Chief Donovan's police cruiser made an abrupt appearance near the cannery. The arrival might have provided some relief if folks trusted Donovan, but no one did. Leroy watched from a distance as the chief stepped out, sidestepping puddles. His posture screamed irritation rather than determination. True to form, Donovan barked at Audrey over police channels to stand down, insisting the situation was too dangerous for amateurs. But Audrey refused, focusing on the mission at hand. Trapped by Leroy's harpoon lines, battered by the storm, and flanked by Harriet's group, the Onyx Tide found themselves cornered. Cross-current screamed more threats, but with each passing minute, they lost ground, both physically and psychologically. Leroy began to feel that the tide, in every sense, was turning. Just when it seemed the Onyx Tide had run out of moves, Breaker Anderson lunged for the battered fishing boat's wheel. He fired up the engine, ignoring the screech of the tensioned cables. The boat lurched forward, snapping one of Leroy's harpoon lines in a shower of sparks. The other line, now severely stressed, groaned ominously against the trawler's hull. Leroy's boat teetered precariously, the storm making stable maneuvering nearly impossible. If Breaker managed to break free entirely, the trawler could slip into deeper waters, leaving them to chase it amid the chaos. "Bear, they're moving!" Leroy shouted over the wind. "Can you do anything from your perch?" Bear's frustrated reply crackled. "The drone's offline, and I don't have a sniper rifle hidden around here. I'm just capturing footage with what battery life I've got left." In a split-second decision, Leroy realized he had to act. He locked the wheel, dashed to the stern, and grabbed the final harpoon from its rack. This one built for precisely the kind of emergency scenario he once faced in deep-sea rescues. Harnessing the timing of a massive wave, Leroy aimed low, pulling the trigger just as the crest lifted the stern. The harpoon soared, hooking into the side of the trawler below the waterline near the rudder assembly. The line went taut, halting the boat's pivot. Breaker let out a shout of rage, slamming the controls. Meanwhile, Crosscurrent struggled to regain control on the deck, still brandishing his firearm. He squeezed off a wild shot that ricocheted off the railing and into the sea. Leroy ducked, heart thrumming. The gangster was rattled, off balance, and that was enough for Audrey, who darted out of the gloom in her harbor patrol skiff. She drew alongside the trawler, aiming her service weapon at Crosscurrent. "Drop it!" she yelled. Another shot spat into the air, perilously close to Audrey's boat. Adrenaline spiked in Leroy's veins. If Crosscurrent killed his daughter, the entire reason for restraint would collapse. But Audrey held her ground, retorting with two measured shots and aimed at the metal deck near Crosscurrent's feet. The whine of bullets on steel startled him enough that he stumbled. Then, in a flurry of movement, Harriet and Wei Ming arrived on either side with their fishing boats, effectively boxing the trawler in. The multi-boat blockade made it impossible for Breaker to gun the engine forward or back. On land, the forklift crew saw which way the wind was blowing and simply abandoned their cargo. Some dropped to their knees, hands on heads, while others ran for the nearest exit, only to find Bill Donnelly and his team blocking it. A standoff ensued there too, Donovan's cruiser lights flickering through the sheets of rain. The chief looked as though he might intervene, but seeing how outnumbered and outmaneuvered the Onyx Tide suddenly was, he seemed more concerned about his own predicament. In the swirl of thunder and lightning, Leroy felt the tension on his line go slack. Breaker had killed the engine, acknowledging the futility. Crosscurrent's expression was savage, but he lowered his weapon. All around, the ragtag alliance of farmers and fishermen, aided by Audrey's legitimate authority and Leroy's unorthodox tactics, had accomplished what once seemed impossible. It took another hour of wrangling to secure all the Onyx Tide members and their associates. But by dawn, local heroes and battered criminals alike stood on the drenched dock. The battered trawler, riddled with harpoon shafts and bullet gouges, rocked in the diminishing storm, while the cannery's pier was littered with crates. Some of these were filled with high-caliber ammunition, others with stolen electronics, and a few with what looked like unregistered firearms. Harriet, Wei, and Zach carefully filmed every inch of the evidence, ensuring there was documentation that couldn't be conveniently lost by any corrupt official. Audrey took a statement from a trembling forklift driver who admitted to working under threats of violence. Meanwhile, Bill's group kept the roads blocked, making it impossible for any latecomers to slip through. Bear had captured hours of incriminating footage, especially the moment the Onyx Tide fired at a uniformed officer. That in itself was enough to trigger federal attention. "We'll be swarming with investigators soon," Bear commented, clapping Leroy on the shoulder. "Job well done, old friend." Leroy nodded, leaning against a piling to catch his breath. Every muscle in his body ached, a reminder that he was well past his physical prime. He looked at Audrey, who was in the middle of a heated exchange with Chief Donovan. The chief appeared furious at being circumvented, but with the evidence so overwhelming and a crowd of townsfolk who had witnessed it all, he had no choice but to begrudgingly accept the arrests. Leroy made a mental note to follow up with outside agencies. Donovan's potential complicity would need deeper investigation. By the time the sun fully rose, gray clouds had begun dispersing, leaving behind a golden light that revealed the extent of the damage. Splintered planks at the cannery's dock, bullet holes in Leroy's boat, and the remnants of a battered forklift listing on the pier. The yacht had run aground on a shallow reef, thanks to Harriet's skillful maneuvering. Its wealthy occupants were found climbing onto the rocks, suits and dress shoes soaked in sea salt. They too were promptly detained by Bill's team on shore. Audrey finally approached her father, shaking out wet hair from under her cap. "Well, that was intense," she said, a tremor in her laugh. Leroy, exhaling a breath he felt he'd held for hours, simply embraced her. "You did good," he muttered softly. "Looked dangerous for a moment there." Audrey nodded, her voice thick with the aftermath of adrenaline. "I'm sorry if I worried you, but you taught me not to back down when people threaten our community." A commotion drew their attention. Cross-Current Roberts was being hauled off in cuffs, cursing loudly about lawyers and payback. Breaker, silent but seething, glowered at Leroy with eyes that promised retribution. Leroy met the look squarely. The older man felt no triumph, only a kind of relief that, at least for now, the Onyx Tide's hold on Harbor Point was broken. Others would keep watch to ensure it stayed that way. In the days and weeks that followed, Harbor Point underwent a transformation that nobody had envisioned just a month prior. Federal investigators arrived en masse, drawn by the trove of evidence implicating high-level criminals who had funneled money and contraband into the Onyx Tide's operations. Chief Donovan found himself under official scrutiny for misconduct, and it wasn't long before he resigned amid a swirl of accusations that he'd accepted bribes to overlook serious crimes. Audrey, on the other hand, received commendations for her bravery, though she insisted the credit be shared with every farmer, fisherman, and volunteer who had stood up to the gang. The largest bombshell came when federal authorities traced the seized contraband back to a spider web of corrupt businesses and even a few government offices across 4 coastal counties. Harbor Point became headline news, not for the violence, but for the way a tight-knit community had refused to succumb to terror. The damaged fishing trawler, still embedded with Leroy's harpoons, was towed into a secure federal dock as a glaring trophy of sorts, proving that a group of criminals, no matter how bold or well-funded, could be brought low by locals who knew their home turf inside and out. In the following months, repairs became a communal effort. Bill Donnelly and his fellow farmers helped fix up Leroy's battered tractor and replant farmland damaged by the Onyx Tide sabotage. Harriet and Wei Ming used their restaurant, along with neighbors like Lydia Zhao, to organize fish fries and fundraisers, channeling resources to families who had suffered financially under the gang's extortion. Old feuds between fishermen and farmers, petty disputes over water usage or road access, seemed to evaporate as people realized how fragile their livelihoods were and how vital unity had proven to be. Leroy himself found a kind of peace in seeing Harbor Point regain confidence. Many nights he would stand at the end of his rebuilt dock, gazing out at the broad Atlantic. The ocean had always been his companion, his battlefield, and his solace. He had faced storms of nature and storms of human cruelty. But this time he wasn't alone. A whole community had braved the tempest with him. Occasionally he felt a pang in his shoulder, the old injury from years of handling heavy ropes in rough seas, and it reminded him that he might not leap into action so swiftly next time. But that was why, in part, he had passed on so much knowledge to the likes of Audrey. One quiet evening, Bear showed up at Leroy's farm carrying a set of battered aerial photos from the drone. "Thought you might like these," he said, handing them over. Each photo was grainy, but undeniably captured the chaos of the trawler pinned by Leroy's lines and the Harbor Patrol boat closing in. Leroy studied them in silence for a moment, then set them aside. "Thank you," he murmured. "I'm glad it's over." And it was, in many ways. The Onyx Tide's leadership disintegrated amid arrests. Cross-Current Roberts and Breaker Anderson vanished into the federal justice system, likely to emerge decades later, if at all. Their powerful backers, whose faces had never been meant to appear on camera, suddenly found themselves indicted after Bear's footage made the rounds in prosecutorial offices. A hush fell over Harbor Point once more, this time the hush of contentment and relief. The entire ordeal revealed a universal truth about small towns on the rocky coast. Never underestimate the quiet farmers, the mild-mannered fishermen, and the unassuming retirees who keep mostly to themselves. When threatened, they might just show the grit and ingenuity that outmatches any gang's swagger. And above all, they prove that the worst storms sometimes aren't brewed by nature, but by men whose greed blinds them to the resilience of good people standing together. Reflecting on all that transpired, from the sinister plots of the gang to the courageous stand taken by an unsuspecting farming community, it's clear that unity and resilience can conquer even the most daunting challenges. I loved seeing how everyday people, bound by a shared devotion to their land and traditions, rose up to defend what mattered most. Their courage not only dismantled a dangerous criminal network, but also sparked a renewed pride in their home. This story taught me that adversity sometimes reveals our greatest strengths, and that a single determined individual, supported by loyal friends and neighbors, can change the fate of an entire town. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you find most inspiring, and would you have done anything differently? Leave a comment and let's keep the conversation going.